Space is absolutely beautiful, yes, because when you're on the night side of the Earth, and even though you have to look through a shuttle window, what you see is more stars than you've seen standing on top of a mountain in the wintertime on a clear night. So the Milky Way is huge and beautiful. It's also beautiful to be looking at back at our Earth at night because it's all lit up with cities and things. And sometimes it's lit up by the northern lights, the aurora borealis, or the southern lights, the aurora australis. So it is such a beautiful experience to get to go to space that you just never forget it.
We are in a very interesting place with a most interesting aviator. I happen to think he's the greatest living American aviator. Robert Hoot Gibson started with a solo at age 16, private license at 17, on to California Polytechnical Institute to become an aeronautical engineer, on into the Navy to become a fighter pilot with 300 carrier landings with F-4s and F-14 Tomcats in Southeast Asia, followed by Top Gun school, or did Top Gun school come before that?
No, Top Gun school happened in the midst of all of that. After my first cruise, which was the combat cruise, I flew in 1972 aboard the USS Coral Sea, and it was after that cruise and before my second cruise.
I remember when I met you the first time, it was at Oshkosh at the EAA event, and you were an astronaut at that time. You had flown 2 missions. Like a dumb guy would say the first time, what attracted you to space? And you kind of incredulously said, this has to do with airplanes. The shuttle's an airplane, and it's going higher and farther and faster than my F-14. So that was the attraction.
And it was interesting. I was fascinated by the space program, and I watched it. And I remember in elementary school and beyond, your teachers would bring in a black and white camera, and you'd get to watch some of the missions. But I had no interest in doing that myself. I was an airplane person. Mom and Dad were both pilots, and so I grew up with it, which in fact is how they met. My dad was a flight instructor, and that's how he met my mom, and they married, and so I've been an airplane person all my life. So I had no interest in flying Mercury or Gemini or Apollo or any of those programs, and then all of a sudden, in about 1974, I became aware of this new vehicle we were developing, which was going to be the Space Shuttle. And I'll never forget, I looked at a page in an aviation magazine, flipped the page, and here's an artist drawing of a space shuttle. And I looked at that and I said, oh man, I have got to get me one of those. Got to have one of those. And so I already knew I wanted to be a test pilot. I wanted to go to test pilot school. I was, at the time, flying F-14 Tomcats. Knew I wanted to be a test pilot. And then once I saw space shuttles, I knew if you want to fly these, you're going to have to be a test pilot school graduate. So it was a small change of direction, and it was a huge change of direction as well. And it's because this thing had wings on it. It's an airplane. It's the world's highest flying, fastest flying airplane, and I wanted to fly those. So I was the pilot, co-pilot, on my first mission, and then mission commander the other 4 times. So I was 8 days in space on my first flight, 6 days on my second flight. My third flight was the second mission after we had suffered the Challenger accident. So it was a test flight, and it was a minimum duration flight. So let's get it up there into orbit and accomplish what we were there to do, and get it back down on the ground and look it over very, very thoroughly, because there were some things we thought we knew about space shuttles that we really didn't. And so that was only 4.5 days. My fourth mission was 8 days, and then my final mission was 10 days. So altogether, 36.5 days.
36.5 days in space. Retired from NASA as the chief astronaut, at which time you got a drink with a bamboo umbrella and sat on a beach, right?
Right, yeah, it was time for me to just go out to pasture,
Except,
except that I wasn't ready to stop flying. And so that's when I really got involved with racing in the unlimited class at the Reno Air Races. I got approached by a friend of a friend that had a Hawker Sea Fury with a big engine in it, and he asked, uh, "You got any interest in racing my unlimited class Hawker Sea Fury in the Reno Air Races?" And I was tempted to say, "How much do I have to pay you to get to do that?" Which is how much I wanted to do that, because over the years as an astronaut, I would sit through a lot of interviews, and you'd frequently get the question, "Okay, you've done all these things in the world of aviation, general aviation, military aviation. I was a Navy test pilot as well, flight test, space shuttles, of course. Is there anything out there that you haven't done that you would like to do?" My answer was always, "I would love to race the unlimited class at the Reno Air Races." And so that started up about the time I left NASA, but I still needed a full-time job, and so I started all over again as a brand new pilot, as a co-pilot with Southwest Airlines. And that was a great experience. I had been a jet fighter guy, of course, all my career. And so I had not that awful much time flying big, heavy airplanes, except for space shuttles, which were big, heavy airplanes. So I started in 1996 as a brand new co-pilot with Southwest Airlines and flew with them for 10 years after retiring from the Navy and leaving NASA. So my dad was born 4 years after the Wright brothers flew, born in 1907. And in the 1930s, he found himself in the Army Air Corps and flew the airmail with the Army when the Army was flying the airmail. And they didn't last very long flying the airmail because they really weren't set up correctly to do that. And what had happened was, February the 1st, 1934, all the airmail contracts were canceled by the president because the idea was, we're going to have the Army fly the airmail. We got all these aviators and airplanes hanging around not doing anything. Let's have the Army fly the airmail. And so the Secretary of the Army was asked, "How long is it going to take you to be ready?" And he said, "Give me 10 days. So on the 10th of February, they flew the airmail. And I have reconstructed that I'm pretty sure my dad flew that same day. And so he flew an airplane called the B-7 Keystone Bomber, open cockpit biplane, two-person crew, biplane with two Liberty V-12s, one between each wing. And he was the first Army airplane to make it through with the mail, bringing the Western airmail. And he started out in, I think, Chicago, and then Cleveland, and then into Newark. And so that's why I believe he flew the very first day. My first recollection was flying with my dad in a J3 Cub. And the reason I have such a vivid memory of it is because I did something wrong. My dad was letting me fly the airplane, and I was flying it a bunch, and of course it was a stick and a throttle, and he let me fly it all over the place, and then we drove it back towards the airport, into the traffic pattern. He let me fly it on downwind, base leg, on final, and then at some point my dad said, "Okay, I'm going to fly it now, so let me fly it." Well, I was disgruntled because I didn't get to keep flying it, and so I sat there for probably a minute or so, and then I decided I'm going to fly it some more, and I grabbed a hold of the control stick and started moving it right as we were in the final flare. And I had lectures from my dad and my mom that when somebody else is flying the airplane, you don't mess with it. And so I was 5 years old, and so I have memories that go back that far. My dad was an aeronautical engineer, and he was the hero of my life. And I remembered from the time I was about 10 years old thinking to myself, I want to be an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot, just like my dad. If I have been successful as an aviator, it's because he was the one that taught me how to fly. He didn't just teach me how to fly, he taught me the why of it at the same time. So he was telling me the engineering, he was telling me the structural ramifications of pulling G's, for example, and how airplanes fly. So that was a great start. But then having the aeronautical engineering degree where you learned about profile drag and induced drag and shockwave drag, transonic drag, all of those things, I'm convinced that made me better prepared to learn how to fly in the Navy when it was time to go through Navy pilot training. So I had not a whole lot of flight experience. I had about 150 hours of flight time before I joined the Navy. But between that and the aeronautical engineering, I had a huge head start. Well, the story of how I wound up in the Navy was a little bit complicated because back in the late 1960s, we had the Vietnam conflict going on. And so the draft was something that was going on. And so you were only going to have 4 years of college deferment that you could have. And since I transferred from a community college into the 4-year university system, I was out of sequence in one course. It was going to take 5 years to graduate. And so at the end of my third year, beginning of my fourth year, I had to fill out a questionnaire if I was going to graduate in 4 years, and the answer was no. And so immediately the draft came after me, and they were going to draft me out of college, right out of college. And so I figured I'd better go sign up for an officer program because I wanted to fly jet fighters. And the first place I went to, I walked into the Air Force recruiter, and the Air Force recruiter said, well, when are you going to graduate? And I said, well, that's the problem. I'm not going to. And he said, well, we don't talk to candidates unless you're within 6 months of graduation. So come back a year from now or a year and a half from now. Well, there wasn't going to be a year from now. And so I walked into the Navy recruiter, and the first question was, what's your draft status? And I said, it's 1A. And he pulls out this form letter that says, Dear Draft Board, please leave this guy alone. We're considering him for an officer program. And he signs it at the bottom, and he said, sign here. This gives us 3 months to work this. And I signed there, so immediately I was impressed. And so that's the story of why I wound up in the Navy instead of in the Air Force. And I'm glad it went that way, because I got to have the experience of flying from aircraft carriers, which is a very unique part of aviation. And I would have missed it most likely if I'd been in the Air Force. So that was a lucky break.
You know, a lot of people these days are not aware of that whole student deferment program that went on during the Vietnam era, but it was quite controversial in a lot of ways. You know, it kind of spoke to the question of, are we really at war to defend this country if we can just say certain people can stay where they are? And I know, being a younger person in those days, I didn't think that much about it, but I think back on it now, and it really affected a lot of lives, including yours.
Oh, it certainly did. And you didn't have a whole lot of options as a male in those days. You either went to college or you went in the military at that time.
At what point were you pretty certain that you were going to Southeast Asia, that you were going to a real fight?
As soon as I saw orders to F-4 Phantoms, I knew that, and particularly since I was going to the West Coast, we knew that we would be taking part in the Vietnam conflict. It wasn't a popular war. Those of us that lived through it at that period of time knew that the country was somewhat torn apart by it, and it wasn't popular here in the U.S., but I had signed on to be a naval officer. And when you sign on to be a naval officer, you're going to receive orders and you will follow those orders. And so it was something that I knew would most likely occur, although you kept thinking, well, gee, maybe this war will be over soon. Maybe it'll be over right away. So I wasn't necessarily going after it because I would get to fly in combat, although that was a very challenging form of flying and would develop you in many, many ways as a pilot, as an aviator. But I knew there was a good chance that I'd wind up in Vietnam, and sure enough, I did. Now, I joined the carrier halfway through that cruise. So all the other pilots in the squadron had experience in combat, and I didn't. But one of the really experienced pilots was one of the pilots that helped found the Navy's Topgun school, Jim Rulifson. And he was the maintenance officer when I first joined the squadron. And then very shortly after that, he became the operations officer. But the ops officer at the time as well was a very experienced, he had flown F-8s previously, Dave Coles, and he was now the ops officer in this F-4 Phantom squadron. He's the one that caused me to get the nickname Hoot, by the way, because when I first joined the squadron, I was a 25-year-old kid. Now, I was experienced. I'd flown the F-4 Phantom in training and been through Navy pilot training, but the way I like to tell the story is that he said, okay, kid, you got a nickname? He didn't call me kid, but he said, okay, well, do you have a nickname? And my real name is Robert, so I said, oh, yes, sir, it's Bob. And he said, no, come on, I mean a real nickname. And I said, well, occasionally in the past I've been called Hoot. And of course, that came from the movie star cowboy, Hoot Gibson. So if your last name's Gibson, you're going to get Hoot for a nickname. My dad told me that he, when he was in the Army Air Corps, had picked up the nickname Hoot. And so that's when I got the nickname Hoot. And that went on my name tag on my flight suit. That went on the side of my cockpit, my canopy in the F-4 Phantom. That went on my coffee cup. So that was April of '72. I changed from being Bob Gibson to being Hoot Gibson.
When you docked with Mir, did the Russians say hello, Hoot?
Yes. Now it was interesting. Sometimes in the different languages, Hoot doesn't come across as Hoot. I remember when I flew a shuttle mission with the Japanese. I flew a joint mission with Japan. One of the Japanese astronauts that we were training couldn't say Hoot, so it was Hoot. It was Hoot. So, and I'm trying to think. I think the Russians were able to pronounce it. Hoot, or Hoot rather.
And then did you have to get into an explanation of old-time Western movies? Probably not.
Well, over the years, since I'm old enough, of course, I knew about Hoot Gibson, the movie star cowboy. But nowadays, oh golly, none of our young people have ever heard anything about someone named Hoot Gibson who was a cowboy. So I'm always explaining, yeah, he was a movie star cowboy.
I guess at some point we should get it on the record. How many types of airplanes have you flown?
That was an interesting question to me. I think it was about 5 years ago. Air and Space Smithsonian Magazine told me that they were going to put me on the cover. And this was, like I say, about five years ago or so. And it was a real honor because they said, you're only the third person that we will have put on our cover of Air and Space Magazine. And they said, okay, for the website, we're going to put a website together and all. Um, how many different airplanes have you flown? We want to put that on the website. And I said, well, I don't know. I've never sat down to count it. And they said, well, then make us a list. So I made a list, and this was some years ago. But anyway, to answer your question, I've kept the list updated ever since then. And the answer is 162 airplanes, or helicopters, or gliders altogether. 162 is the number at this point.
Earlier, we talked about the fact that you felt air racing was more dangerous than space. And I guess the only way I can ask it is, how do you process danger? How do you say what I'm going to do in the face of danger is worth it? If that makes any sense.
Well, to answer that, I guess I'll say that, I get questioned all the time, do you consider yourself to be a risk taker? And I say, no, I don't consider myself to be a risk taker. All of the risky things that I've done, though, are all in the world of aviation, in the world of flying. Now, I have a lot of experience. I have more than 14,500 hours of flight time. And so, with all of that, I believe that I am very much able to analyze what I'm about to do. Certainly, the aeronautical engineering is a big advantage for being able to analyze. Also, the experience of test pilot school, being able to do a risk analysis that goes along with that. And so the things that I've done that are really exciting, like flying in the air races, I think are a bit of a calculated judgment that says, okay, I'm going to have to be very much alert and very much cautious because air racing is probably more dangerous than the space shuttle was, because we flew the space shuttle 135 times and we lost two of those. But when you look at air racing, I raced at the Reno Air Races over the course of 18 years altogether, and in 8 of those years, we had at least a pilot fatality. So 44% of the years that I raced at Reno, we had a pilot die. And one of those years, 2007, we had 3 pilots die. So based on a statistic like that, that's probably, well, it is. It's more dangerous than flying combat missions over Hanoi in the Vietnam War, and it's more dangerous than going to space. But there is a huge reward for taking that risk. Seeing what the Earth looks like from space is certainly worth that risk. And our experience and the Russian experience has been that the majority of your missions fly just fine and come back safely. And there doesn't have to be a fatal mission, even 1 out of 10. So certainly everything we do in life is a calculated risk, and doing that was a calculated risk. And as far as air racing goes, I am not brave enough to race in one of the classes out there at Reno where the airplanes are all nearly identical, that being the T6 class. You could offer me a whole lot of money and I wouldn't take it to race in the T6 class because those airplanes are too closely bunched up and too even, whereas the classes that I've raced in, the unlimited class, the jet class, and the Formula One class, airplanes are going to space out reasonably. So sure, right at the start, you're right next to 9 other airplanes, but very rapidly, you are pretty much flying on your own, especially if you're out in front. I got to have that experience the one time, and that's really great. That's really great to be way out in front by yourself. And sure, there's a risk of your hitting the ground, but if you hit the ground, it's probably because you did it. And so it's the sort of thing that, are you confident that you can fly that thing and not hit a pylon, not hit the ground? And do you think you're capable of doing that? And if the answer is no, then you better not do it. But I certainly always felt that, yes, I'm capable of keeping the airplane above the ground and keeping it in the air. And so it's one of those calculated risks.
We could probably talk about your career for years, but what can we look forward to in some of the upcoming podcasts? What are some of the things you'd like to share with pilots, aviators, or students, anyone out there, about what it's been like to fly this remarkable career?
Well, I've managed to learn a lot of things about flying airplanes. I've learned a lot of things about managing a crew. I've learned a lot of things about leadership and learned a lot of things about human nature and how to get the best out of not just yourself, but your crew as well. And there are so many fascinating things out there in the world of aviation that we need to talk about.
20 feet per second. Now on video. Houston, Columbia, we got wheel stop.
Welcome back to Earth, you seasoned space veterans. We're working on you, Delta.
Roger that, Houston. Seasoned by an extra 2 days. Mission lapse time to touchdown once again is unofficially 6 days, 2 hours, 4 minutes.
Houston. Post-landing per procedures, no Deltas.
Copy that, Fred.